40 minutes before I went under anesthesia for a surgery my surgeon had described, plainly as not without real risk, my mother texted me a single line. "Can't make it today, sweetie. Paige's gender reveal got moved up and we don't want to miss it. You'll be fine." I was having a tumor removed from my thyroid. Not confirmed benign yet, not a routine outpatient procedure, a 4-hour surgery with a recovery period my doctor had specifically warned could involve serious complications, the kind of surgery where the intake nurse asks, as a standard part of the paperwork, who your emergency contact is and who's picking you up afterward. I didn't have an answer for either question when they asked, not one I was ready to say out loud. Both of my parents were 40 minutes away at my sister's gender reveal party, waiting to find out whether they were about to become grandparents to a boy or a girl, while I lay on a gurney with genuinely no idea who was going to be there when I woke up. Then a name occurred to me, and I gave it to the intake nurse, and that single decision ended up mattering more than anything else that happened that entire day. Because when my parents finally found out who I'd actually listed, hours later, it changed something in my family that 4 decades of smaller disappointments never quite managed to. Quick facts before anything else. I was 31 at the time. The lump in my thyroid had been found 8 weeks earlier, during a routine physical, and the biopsy results had come back indeterminate, not clearly benign, not clearly malignant, which meant surgical removal and a full pathology review were the only way to actually know what we were dealing with. My sister, Paige, is 26, 6 months pregnant with her first child at the time, and had scheduled her gender reveal party for that same Saturday afternoon, a date she'd picked, notably, after I'd already told my parents my surgery date 3 weeks earlier. I want to be honest and say clearly, I don't blame Paige for any of this. She didn't ask our parents to choose her party over my surgery. What happened that day was entirely a choice my parents made, and it's a choice I need to walk you through carefully, because the surgery itself is really only the surface of a much older pattern. Before I tell you who I actually listed as my emergency contact, I need you to understand 3 moments from years earlier, because they explain exactly why, lying on that gurney, I already knew, on some level, exactly what my parents were going to choose. My parents, Carol and Denny, have spent most of my adult life treating my milestones as secondary to whatever Paige has going on. I want to be precise about this because my parents favor my sister is such a common complaint that it can sound almost generic if I don't ground it in specifics. Moment 1. 5 years ago, I passed the licensing exam for my career as a physician assistant. A genuinely difficult, multi-part exam with a pass rate hovering around 80% on the first attempt, the culmination of 6 years of school and clinical training. I called my parents the day I got my results, expecting at minimum a warm congratulations. My mother said, "That's great, honey," and then spent the next 10 minutes of the call updating me on Paige's new apartment, a detail I hadn't asked about and that had no obvious connection to anything I'd just told her. Moment 2. 3 years ago, I bought my first house. A modest 3-bedroom I'd saved for over years of careful budgeting on a physician assistant's salary. My parents visited once, spent most of the visit commenting on how much more space Paige and her boyfriend at the time would eventually need for a family, a comparison that had nothing to do with my house and everything to do with my parents' apparent inability to discuss anything in my life without redirecting it back toward Paige's. Moment 3. The one that, in hindsight, most directly foreshadowed the surgery. 18 months ago, I went through a difficult breakup with someone I'd been with for 4 years, a relationship I genuinely believed was heading toward marriage. I called my mother the week it ended, upset, needing some real support. She listened for a few minutes, then mentioned, almost as an aside, that Paige and her now husband had just gotten engaged and asked whether I'd be able to be in a good headspace for the engagement party, since it was coming up soon and she didn't want anything to cast a shadow over Paige's happiness. I was calling my mother in genuine distress, and her primary concern was whether my distress might inconvenience an unrelated celebration for my sister 3 weeks later. Moment 4, and the closest preview of what was coming. About 10 months before the surgery, I'd had a smaller outpatient procedure, a biopsy on a different, ultimately unrelated concern, and my mother had, at the time, promised to be there, then canceled the morning of because Paige had a prenatal appointment she didn't want to go to alone, despite her husband being fully available and, as far as I ever learned, never actually asked. I remember sitting in that waiting room alone, telling myself it was a minor procedure, that it didn't really matter, that I was being oversensitive about a routine appointment. I didn't fully let myself see, at the time, that I was quietly rehearsing an excuse for my mother that she hadn't even asked me to make. By the time I scheduled my thyroid surgery, I had years of data telling me exactly how my parents weighed my life against Paige's whenever the two happened to compete for their attention. So when that text came through, 40 minutes before I was wheeled into an operating room, some old, tired part of me wasn't even surprised. It felt, honestly, like the natural, if still deeply painful, conclusion of a pattern I'd been quietly documenting for years. Here's exactly how the surgery day actually unfolded, and exactly why I made the decision I made when the intake nurse asked who my emergency contact was. I'd told my parents about the surgery 3 weeks in advance, giving them plenty of notice, specifically because I wanted them there. I'm not going to pretend this surgery wasn't frightening. An indeterminate thyroid biopsy carries real uncertainty, and while the odds favored a benign result, my surgeon had been direct with me about the real risks involved in the procedure itself, including potential nerve damage that could affect my voice permanently if something went wrong during the removal. My mother had confirmed, twice, over those 3 weeks, that she and my father would be there, not just dropping me off, but staying through the surgery and being present when I woke up, since patients undergoing general anesthesia are required to have someone available to take them home and monitor them for the following 24 hours. Paige's gender reveal had originally been scheduled for the following weekend. I know this because I'd seen the invitation, sent out nearly a month earlier, with a clear date that didn't conflict with my surgery at all. What I found out only days before my procedure was that Paige had decided to move the party up by a week, for reasons that, even now, remain a little unclear to me. Something about wanting to do it before a certain point in her pregnancy, or coordinating around her in-laws' travel schedule, details that shifted slightly depending on who I asked. What matters is that the new date landed squarely on my surgery day, and rather than telling Paige the date didn't work for them, or asking her to consider moving it, given that they'd already committed to being with me, my parents simply decided, without much visible deliberation, that the gender reveal was where they needed to be. I found out the actual scope of it the morning of my surgery, in the pre-op waiting area, sitting alone in a hospital gown, when that text came through. "Can't make it today, sweetie. Gender reveal got moved up. You'll be fine." The intake nurse asked her standard questions about 20 minutes later, and one of them changed the entire trajectory of that day. I want to walk through this moment slowly, because it wasn't dramatic in the way you might expect. It was quiet and a little numb, the particular flatness that comes from finally, fully absorbing something you'd suspected was true for a long time. The pre-op nurse, a kind, businesslike woman named Renata, went through the standard intake checklist: allergies, medications, and then, routinely, who my emergency contact was and who would be picking me up after the procedure. I told her my parents had originally been listed, but that they'd just texted to say they weren't coming. She asked, gently, whether there was someone else I could call. I sat with that question for a moment, genuinely unsure. running through a mental list of options that all felt somehow insufficient. Friends who lived too far, co-workers who weren't close enough for something this significant. Then I thought of my Aunt Roberta, my father's older sister, a retired ICU nurse who lived about 20 minutes from the hospital and who had, over the years, quietly become one of the steadiest, most reliable people in my life, even though she wasn't someone I saw constantly. Roberta had never had children of her own, and had, in a way I hadn't fully appreciated until that exact moment, spent years showing up for me in small, consistent ways my own parents rarely managed, remembering my work anniversaries, checking in after difficult breakups, asking real, detailed questions about my career that my mother had never once bothered to ask. I called her from that pre-op bay, my voice shakier than I expected, and explained the situation. Roberta didn't hesitate for even a second. She said she'd be there within 25 minutes, and she was. I listed her as my emergency contact. I listed her as the person authorized to receive updates during my surgery and the person who would be taking me home afterward. It felt, in that moment, less like a grand statement and more like simple practicality. I needed someone reliable, and Roberta was reliable. I had no idea, lying on that gurney, how much that single administrative decision was about to matter to my parents. My parents found out who I'd actually listed about 6 hours later, and the way they found out is the part of this story that changed everything. While I was in surgery, Roberta sat in the waiting room and, being a retired ICU nurse with decades of hospital experience, asked precise, informed questions of the surgical team during their periodic updates, questions detailed enough that the surgeon later told me, during my follow-up appointment, that he'd assumed she had a medical background before she even mentioned it, simply from the specificity of what she was asking. My parents, meanwhile, were at Paige's gender reveal, which, based on what I pieced together later, had gone off without incident. Blue smoke from a canister, confirming they were expecting a grandson, a celebration that ran for a couple of hours before my mother, sometime in the early evening, apparently remembered to check her phone for updates on my surgery. What she found, when she called the hospital's main line to ask about my status, was that she was not, in fact, listed as my emergency contact anymore, and that hospital staff, following standard privacy protocol, could not release detailed information to her over the phone since she wasn't the person authorized on file. My mother told me later that this moment, being told by a hospital operator that she wasn't authorized to receive information about her own daughter's surgery, was one of the more disorienting experiences of her life, though I confess I didn't feel much sympathy hearing that, given the choice that had put her in that position in the first place. She called me directly, panicked, sometime while I was still in recovery, groggy from anesthesia, unable to answer. Roberta, sitting beside my bed, saw the call come through and, at my mother's increasingly frantic follow-up calls, eventually answered on my behalf, explaining, calmly and without much editorializing, that I'd come through surgery fine, that I was recovering, and that she'd been the one there with me since I'd listed her as my emergency contact that morning. My mother arrived at the hospital about 40 minutes later, alone. My father, apparently, had stayed behind to help Paige and her husband clean up from the party, a detail that, when I heard it, told me almost everything I needed to know about how that entire day's priorities had actually been sorted in real time. What my mother said when she walked into my recovery room, and what I said back, is the conversation I'd been quietly building toward, without fully realizing it, for years. My mother came into the recovery room looking genuinely shaken, which I want to acknowledge honestly, because I don't think her distress in that moment was performed. I think the hospital's refusal to share information with her had been the first time in a long while that the actual, concrete consequences of her choices had been made unmistakably real to her, rather than something she could quietly rationalize afterward. She asked, almost immediately, why I'd listed Roberta instead of her. I was still groggy, my throat sore from the surgery and the breathing tube, but I managed to tell her, plainly, that I'd listed Roberta because Roberta was the person who'd actually shown up. I told her I hadn't done it to punish my mother, not really. I'd done it because, in the moment the nurse asked, I needed someone I could actually count on, and my mother, at that exact moment, was 40 minutes away watching blue smoke rise into the air for a grandchild who wasn't due for another 3 months. My mother tried, initially, to explain that Paige had moved the date without much warning, that it had felt too late to back out once RSVPs were already confirmed, that she hadn't fully understood, when she sent that text, how serious the surgery actually was. I told her, as clearly as my sore throat allowed, that I had explained the risks to her directly, 3 weeks earlier, in detail, and that not fully understanding wasn't really an accurate description of what had happened. She had understood. She had simply decided, when the two events landed on the same day, that Paige's party mattered more. My father arrived at the hospital about an hour later, having finally left Paige's house, and I want to be honest that by that point, I didn't have much emotional energy left to have the same conversation twice. I told him, briefly, what had happened, and watched him absorb it with considerably less visible distress than my mother had shown, which, in its own way, told me something too. Roberta, who'd stayed the entire time, said something to both of my parents before she finally left that evening that I think mattered more than anything I managed to say myself, still recovering from anesthesia. She said, quietly but directly, that she'd raised nieces and nephews her whole life, without ever having children of her own, and that if there was one thing 4 decades of that experience had taught her, it was that kids remember, with total clarity, exactly who showed up when it actually mattered, and exactly who didn't. My mother didn't respond to that right away. She sat down in the chair beside my bed, quiet for a long moment, and then asked Roberta, in a voice that sounded smaller than I was used to hearing from her, whether she thought this was something that could actually be repaired, or whether she'd simply damaged something in me permanently that day. I remember being surprised that she asked Roberta this, instead of asking me directly, though in hindsight I think she understood, on some level, that I didn't have the emotional bandwidth in that moment, still groggy and raw, to reassure her the way she was hoping to be reassured. Roberta told her, honestly, that she didn't know, that repair wasn't really something one conversation could accomplish, and that it would depend far less on what my mother said over the following days than on what she actually did, consistently, over the following months. She said it plainly, without cruelty, but without softening it either, and I remember thinking, even through the haze of the anesthesia, that it was exactly the right thing to say. Not a reassurance my mother hadn't earned yet, but an honest, achievable standard she could actually work toward if she meant it. The pathology results came back 7 days later, benign, thankfully, and I want to walk you through what actually happened in my family over the following months, because it wasn't the instant, dramatic reckoning you might expect. I want to be honest that the week following my surgery was physically difficult regardless of the family drama layered on top of it. A sore throat, real fatigue, the general disorientation of recovering from general anesthesia while also processing what my parents' absence had actually revealed about where I stood in their priorities. Roberta stayed with me for the first 3 days, managing my medications, driving me to a follow-up appointment, doing all of the quiet, unglamorous caretaking that my parents had opted out of. My mother called daily during that first week, increasingly contrite each time, though I found myself, for the first time in my life, genuinely unmoved by her contrition in the moment. I'd spent 31 years absorbing smaller versions of that day's choice, and the accumulated weight of all of it made her apologies feel less like a real reckoning and more like the same pattern of managing my feelings that she'd always used to smooth things over without actually changing anything underneath. The biopsy came back benign a week later, which was an enormous relief medically, though I noticed, with some bitterness, that my mother's response to the good news carried a kind of forced brightness that felt, to me, like an attempt to move past the entire incident now that the scary medical uncertainty was resolved, rather than genuinely reckoning with what her absence had meant, regardless of the outcome. I told her, directly, that the benign result didn't retroactively make her choice acceptable, that she couldn't have known, when she sent that text, how the surgery would turn out, and that the choice to prioritize Paige's party had been made under genuine uncertainty about my health, which made it worse, not better, that she'd chosen the party anyway. What actually started to shift things, slowly, over the following months, wasn't any single dramatic conversation. It was something smaller, and it started with my father, unexpectedly. About 6 weeks after my surgery, my father called me alone, without my mother, something he rarely did. He told me, in a conversation considerably more direct than I was used to having with him, that he'd been thinking about that day a lot, and that helping clean up after Paige's party while I was in recovery had started to sit worse and worse with him the more time passed. He said he thought, in the moment, staying to help Paige had felt like the easier, more immediate obligation, and that it hadn't occurred to him, until much later, how that choice would look and feel from my side of it. He apologized, plainly, without much qualification, in a way that felt different from my mother's earlier, more anxious contrition. What struck me most about that call wasn't the apology itself, but a detail he mentioned almost as an aside, that he'd started, in the weeks since, quietly noticing how often family conversations defaulted to Paige's pregnancy, almost by reflex, even in moments that had nothing to do with her at all. He told me about a recent dinner where a cousin had asked how my recovery was going and how he'd watched my mother answer for about 10 seconds before pivoting, seemingly without even registering she'd done it, into an update on Paige's 3rd trimester symptoms. He said noticing that, really noticing it, for what felt like the first time, had been uncomfortable in a way he hadn't expected, and that he wasn't sure how long that pattern had actually been running underneath their family's day-to-day conversations before that phone call with me forced him to actually look at it. My mother's shift took longer, and I think it required a harder confrontation than my father's did. About 3 months after the surgery, at a family dinner that Roberta, notably, was now regularly included in, my mother brought up the surgery unprompted and told me, with what felt like real vulnerability, that Roberta's comment in the recovery room, about kids remembering exactly who showed up, had stayed with her more than almost anything else from that entire period. She said she'd started to notice, once she was actually paying attention, how consistently she'd defaulted to prioritizing Paige across years of smaller decisions, not because she loved Paige more, she insisted, but because Paige had always been the child who asked more directly, who made her preferences more visible, while I had always been the child who handled things quietly and didn't make a fuss, which, my mother admitted, had made it easy, over years, to simply assume I'd be fine without the same level of active attention. I told her that assumption had cost me a lot, over a lot of years, and that not making a fuss had never actually meant I didn't need the same consideration Paige received. It had just meant I'd learned, early, not to expect it. Paige and I, for what it's worth, had our own conversation about all of this eventually, separate from our parents. She hadn't fully understood, in the moment, how directly her party's new date had collided with my surgery, and she was genuinely upset once she understood the full picture, telling me she wished our parents had simply told her the date didn't work, rather than letting her plan a party that ended up costing me their presence on a day I genuinely needed them. I believed her, and our relationship, unlike my relationship with our parents, didn't really require much repair. She'd been, in her own way, as unaware of the full weight of the situation as I initially assumed my parents had been, before I understood, more fully, that their choice had been considerably more deliberate than hers. About 4 months after the surgery, something happened that ended up testing, in a much more concrete way, whether anything had actually changed. And it wasn't a small thing. I had a follow-up scan scheduled about 4 months after the initial surgery, a routine check to confirm the surgical site had healed properly and that nothing concerning had developed in the surrounding tissue. It wasn't a procedure with any real risk attached to it. A straightforward imaging appointment, the kind of thing that would ordinarily be unremarkable. But I want to walk through it, because it became an unplanned, almost accidental test of everything that had supposedly shifted in my family over the preceding months. The appointment happened to fall on the same weekend as Paige's baby shower, which had been scheduled for weeks, and which I fully intended to attend myself, later that same afternoon, once my scan was finished. I hadn't asked my parents to be at the scan. It genuinely wasn't a big enough procedure to require anyone's presence, and I told my mother as much when the subject came up a couple of weeks earlier, mostly just mentioning the date in passing. What I didn't expect was my mother asking, unprompted, whether she could come with me anyway, not because it was medically necessary, but because, in her words, she didn't want me sitting through any kind of hospital appointment alone again, regardless of how minor it was. I remember being genuinely surprised by the offer, and a little suspicious of it, if I'm honest, given how many similar assurances in the past had quietly evaporated once something else came up. She actually came. She sat with me through the scan, asked the technician informed, careful questions afterward, and then drove with me directly to Paige's baby shower, where she stayed only briefly before telling Paige, honestly, that she needed to get me home to rest before doing anything else that day. A small, ordinary sentence that would have meant nothing from most parents, but which felt, from her, like an actual reordering of priorities I'd watched go the opposite direction for years. I don't want to oversell this moment. It was a low-stakes scan, not a 4-hour surgery, and I'm aware that showing up for a 15-minute imaging appointment is a considerably lower bar than the one she'd failed months earlier. But it mattered to me anyway, precisely because it was low stakes, because it suggested the change wasn't only happening under the pressure of a genuine crisis, where guilt might temporarily override old habits, but was starting to show up in smaller, easier-to-skip moments too, the kind that are actually more revealing of a real, lasting shift than any single dramatic gesture could be. I mentioned this to Roberta afterward, half expecting her characteristic bluntness to puncture my cautious optimism. Instead, she told me that in her decades of nursing, she'd learned that the true measure of whether someone had actually changed was never the big, dramatic moment where everyone's watching. It was whether they showed up for the small, forgettable ones too, when there was no audience and no crisis forcing their hand. She said my mother showing up for a 15-minute scan, with no real stakes attached, told her more than the entire conversation in my recovery room ever could have. There's a wider pattern underneath this story that I think matters more than the surgery itself, and it's worth sitting with before I wrap this up. I've thought a lot about why that single text message, "Can't make it today, sweetie, you'll be fine," cut as deep as it did, deeper, honestly, than the surgery's actual medical risk ever fully accounted for. I think it's because that text wasn't really about a gender reveal party. It was the clearest, most literal confirmation of a lifetime pattern, a family that had quietly, consistently sorted its attention and presence according to who asked more visibly and who simply handled things quietly on their own, without ever consciously deciding that one child's needs mattered less. Nobody in my family, I genuinely believe, ever sat down and decided Paige deserved more care than I did. It accumulated, decision by decision, year after year, until the accumulated weight of it meant that on the one day I most needed my parents in a hospital waiting room, they were 40 minutes away watching blue smoke rise into the sky instead. If you've ever been the child in your family who didn't make a fuss, who handled things quietly, who was assumed to be fine without the same active attention a sibling received simply because you didn't ask for it as loudly, I think you already recognize the shape of this story long before I told you who I actually listed as my emergency contact. That particular kind of neglect rarely announces itself as cruelty. It just quietly assumes that the person who copes well doesn't need the same level of care as the person who visibly, insistently asks for it. Right up until a moment like a surgery makes the gap between those two things impossible to ignore any longer. What I've come to appreciate most, looking back, isn't the vindication of watching my mother learn she wasn't authorized to receive information about my own surgery, though I won't pretend that moment didn't mean something to me. It's the fact that Roberta, someone who'd never had children of her own, who simply, consistently showed up, ended up teaching my entire family something about presence that 31 years of blood relation apparently hadn't managed to establish on its own. Sometimes it takes someone entirely outside the immediate pull of a family's old patterns to see clearly what everyone inside it has simply learned to live with. If you've made it this far, I want to know, have you ever been the low-maintenance one in your family? The one everyone assumed would be fine without the same attention a sibling received? Tell me what happened in the comments. I read every single one, and some of the most powerful stories on this channel have started exactly there. If this story hit close to home, there's more coming. I post a new one every few days, so if you don't want to miss the next one, you already know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.